Hello, mathematicians. Today we're going to be rounding decimals. Before we start rounding, let's talk about why we even round numbers. Well, we round numbers to make them easier to work with. And we make them easier to work with by getting rid of the digits that give us more specificity than we need. That means the numbers are more specific than we really need. So, for an example, I've got a whole number here, 733,919. It's the number of people in Seattle in 2021. Well, when I'm talking just to everyday people about how many people are in Seattle, I don't need to tell them. There are exactly 733,919,000 people in Seattle. That's too specific. So I might just say, oh yeah, did you know there are 733,000 people in Seattle? So that's rounded to the thousands place. Or it might even be enough to just say, there are 700,000 people in Seattle, about, rounding to the nearest 100,000th place. We don't need all these specific digits. It's the same thing with working with decimals. You might recognize this number. These are the first few decimal places of pi. And the number pi, actually, you'll work a lot more with it in middle school when you work with circles. But these decimal digits never end. They go on forever. And so it would be impossible to write every single place value of pi every time you have to calculate with it. So usually you just use a certain number of place values, like maybe the first 2 decimal places or the first 5. And that's good enough for a lot of the calculations that you're going to use it for. In this case, I just rounded pi to the first 2 decimal places, 3 and 14 hundredths. So that's why we round some decimals. Let's do some. So here I've got 3.141, 3 and 141 thousandths. It's the first 3 decimal places of pi, and I want to round it to the nearest tenth. So the first step I take when I round a decimal number is underline the place value I'm rounding to, so the tenths place. This one is in the tenths place, so I'm going to underline it. The next step I like to take is write down my 2 options for rounding. What do I mean by my 2 options? Well, this number here is 3 and 1/10, but it's a little bit more than 3 and 1/10, right? And so we have to determine, is this number closer to just 3 and 1/10? Or is it closer to 3 and 2/10? Those are my only 2 options for rounding. I either round to the tenth that the number already has, or just add 1 to that place value and round to 3 and 2/10. That's all we're doing when we're rounding. There's just 2 options. Either stay the same at that 1 in the tenths place or go up to a 2 in the tenths place. So I like to show this on a number line here. I need to figure out, basically, if I'm rounding, I need to figure out where this number fits on this number line between 3 and 1/10 and 3 and 2/10. Now, in order to do that, there's only one digit in this number that I care about. It's the digit directly behind the place value I'm rounding to, that 4. None of the other decimal places even matter. So if I had a bunch of numbers behind here, it doesn't even matter. The only number that matters is this digit behind the place value I'm rounding to. You might have heard this phrase before. Once you look at the digit behind the place value you're rounding to, you might have heard something like 5 or more, raise the score. 4 or less, let it rest. What it's referring to is when you look back at this digit behind the place you're rounding to, if that digit is 5 or greater, then you round this number up to the next tenth. If this number that you're looking at is 4 or less, let it rest, meaning you just let it rest at this 1/10, meaning it must be closer to 3 and 1/10. Let me show you on a number line why this rule works, because I want you to know why it works. If we look at this number line here between 3 and 1/10 and 3 and 2/10, we have to figure out, well, what's this number in the middle? Because I have to figure out if this number that I'm rounding is closer to this side of the number line or it's closer to that side of the number line. In order to figure out what's in the middle, we need to add a place value here. So 3 and 1/10 is the same as 3 and 10 hundredths. 3 and 2/10 is the same as 3 and 20 hundredths. So what's right in the middle of 10 and 20? That's right, 15. 3 and 15 hundredths. So now I can fill in the rest of this number line. So any numbers between 3 and 10 hundredths and a little less than 3 and 15 hundredths would be closer to 3 and 10 hundredths. So this would be 3 and 11 hundredths, 3 and 12 hundredths, 3 and 13 hundredths, and this would be 3 and 14 hundredths. 3 and 15 hundredths, this would be 3 and 16 hundredths, 3 and 17 hundredths, 3 and 18 hundredths, and 3 and 19 hundredths. So this is how this rule works. It's using a number line. I can show you why it works. So look at the digit behind the place you're rounding to. We're rounding to the tens place, right, in this number. So if I need to look at the digit behind the place that I'm rounding to. Since I'm rounding to the tens place, I'm putting an arrow up to all these hundredths digits. So 5 or more raise the score, meaning if the digit behind the place that I'm rounding to is 5 or more, meaning a 5 or a 6 or a 7 or an 8 or a 9, that number is going to be closer to 3 and 2/10, closer to the next tenth up. Now you might be saying, wait. If that digit's 5, it's not closer to that, it's right in the middle. And you're exactly right. Mathematicians just had to make a decision. Sometimes we're going to get numbers that are right in between our two choices. What do we do with those? And mathematicians have just decided, well, from there, we're just going to round up. And then the saying says 4 or less, let it rest. Meaning if this digit in the hundredths place is a 4, 3, 2, or 1, it's closer to 3 and 1/10. So we're going to round it down. That's why this rule works. Now, I have an entire video rounding decimals using number lines. I encourage you to watch it. But right now, the rest of this video, we're just going to use this rule to round numbers. So using this rule, I look at the digit behind the place value I'm rounding to. I'm rounding to the tens place. I look at the 4, and 4 is 4 or less, let it rest. So that 4 tells me that this number is closer to 3 and 1/10. So I round this number to 3 and 1/10. Okay, let's do a few more rapid fire without the number line. So we're going to go down this column first. We're going to keep rounding to the nearest tenth first. And we're going to round those same numbers to the nearest hundredth. So around the nearest tenth, I'm just going to underline the digit in the tens place, which is a 7. The only number that matters is the number right behind that 4 in the hundredths place. So my saying says 5 or more, raise the score. 4 or less, let it rest. I forgot to write down my options for rounding. So I've got 8 and 7/10, or one more tenth would be 8/10. So it would be 8 and 8/10 would be my other option. But now I look back, the 4 tells me 4 or less, let it rest. So I'm just going to round this one. It just rests at this 7/10. This number is closer to 8 and 7/10 than it is to 8 and 8/10. Next one, 43 and 283 thousandths. So I'm going to underline the tenths place because I'm rounding the nearest tenth. So my options are, this is either going to rest at 43 and 2/10, or it's going to be closer to 43 and the next tenth, 43 and 3/10. And the only number that matters is this one behind the place I'm rounding to, the 8. And my 8 tells me that's more than 5. 5 or more raise the score. So I'm going to round this number up to 43 and 3/10. This number is closer to 43 and 3/10 than 43 and 2/10. Okay, I've got a little bit of a trickier one below here. Still rounding the nearest tenth, so I underline the digit in the tens place. So this number is a little bit more than 5 and 9/10, right? Because it's 5 and 9/10, but a little bit more after that, some more place values. So my options for rounding, it's either going to go to 5 and 9/10, or what's one more tenth than 9? 10. Well, I can't write a 10 in that place value. So if I added a tenth to 5 and 9 tenths, what would I get? 6 tenths. So here are my options. Is this number closer to 5 and 9 tenths, or is it closer to 6? Well, the number that tells me is the number right behind the place I'm rounding to, 6. 6 is 5 or more, so I'm going to raise the score. I'm going to round up to 6 wholes. This number rounds to 6. 3 more. Thanks for sticking with me. 3 more. We're going to round these to the nearest hundredth. So these are the same numbers from over here, but now I'm going to round to a different place. Round to the hundredths place. So the hundredths place is here. So this number is either going to round to 8 and 74 hundredths, or 1 more than 4 is 5. So 8 and 75 hundredths. What number tells me where to round? It's the number behind the place I'm rounding to. So this 2, 4 or less, let it rest. So this 2 tells me that this whole number is closer to 8 and 74 hundredths. Here, the hundredths place has an 8 in it. So my options for rounding are 43 and 28 hundredths, or what's 1 more than 8? That's it, 9. 43 and 29 hundredths. So let's look to the digit that tells us where to round up or down. It is a 3, and by now you know that 4 or less, let it rest. So this is going to round to 43 and 28 hundredths. Last one, 5 and 961 thousandths. 6 is in the hundredths place. So my options for rounding, it's either going to round to 5 and 96 hundredths, or 1 more than 6 is 7. So 5 and 97 hundredths. Look back to the number that tells me where to round to, and it's a 1, which this tells me to round, to just let it rest. 4 or less, let it rest. It's going to round to 5 and 96 hundredths. There you go. There is rounding decimal numbers.